When we talk about movies in development hell, there's probably no film more synonymous with the term than Ghostbusters 3. And despite the fact it never went anywhere, we still got decades of rumours, of possibilities, of false starts. And unfortunately, like many other films in development hell, we got a definitive end that meant we were never really going to get the third Ghostbusters film that we all hoped for. This is Hellraiser, Ghostbusters 3. The first Ghostbusters film was a mammoth success. It was the second highest grossing film of 1984, falling just 5 million short of Beverly Hills Cop. In fact, before the release of Beverly Hills Cop at the end of the year, it was the highest grossing comedy film of all time. Even when adjusted for inflation, Ghostbusters falls just behind Avengers Infinity War as far as its domestic gross. Just to give you an idea of how massive this film was, the film also inspired a range of merchandise, at a time when merchandising for a film was still a novel idea. And while Star Wars proved the possibility, Ghostbusters helped confirm it. It spawned a cartoon, The Real Ghostbusters, which exploded the merchandising potential, and by 1988 they had generated $200 million in revenue from merchandise. And in that same year, the Proton Pack was the most popular toy in the UK. Without surprise, a sequel was always going to happen, and in 1989 it arrived with Ghostbusters 2.
Ghostbusters! Yes, that's right! Ghostbusters! We're back!
Very simply put, Ghostbusters 2 was a mess. Despite the success of the original film, things did not come together quickly or neatly for a sequel. Firstly, a sequel needed the approval of 4 people to occur. Director Ivan Reitman, co-writers and performers Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd, and famously, Bill Murray. Something that would be a kind of point of contention for many fans over the years, as he continued to be a holdout on a third film. However, in the case of Ghostbusters 2, a problem was the fact that since the release of the first film, he had largely stepped away from acting, aside from the odd cameo, partly due to the explosive success of Ghostbusters, but also because his passion project, The Razor's Edge, had flopped shortly after the release of Ghostbusters. In fact, one of his main reasons for doing Ghostbusters was so that The Razor's Edge would be greenlit. But frustrated with his failure, Murray took a break from acting until 1988's Scrooged. For a while, even Murray's return to acting didn't guarantee another film though. There were some grievances between the 4 key figures of the series that needed to be addressed. Once those were ironed out, the film was a go, with Murray deciding to return upon reflecting on how much fun he had making the original and putting his disdain for sequels aside. But in retrospect, it seems that disdain may have been justified.
Someone has to deal with it. And who are you going to call?
The superstars of the supernatural are back to nuke the spooks.
2 in the box. We're the beautiful. We're the only Ghostbusters. We're back. Who you gonna call?
Our next film is Ghostbusters 2, the sequel to the best-selling movie comedy of all time, and it's a major disappointment. And what's so surprising is that the film contains little comic energy or invention. It looks as if the filmmakers, particularly the writers, simply didn't try to do anything special.
Ghostbusters 2 was released in June of 1989, in one of the most legendary years in blockbuster cinema. It was also the year with the most sequels to date, including the likes of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, The Karate Kid Part 3, Star Trek V The Final Frontier, and Lethal Weapon 2. Along with original successes like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Dead Poets Society, and of course, the box office behemoth and #1 domestic film of the year, Batman. That is to say, it was a competitive year, with films often competing for success. In fact, Ghostbusters 2 opened just a week before Batman. Ghostbusters 2 actually broke a record for a 3-day gross, which was broken the following weekend by Batman. While this certainly didn't help the film's chances, neither did the film's quality. If we're totally honest, Ghostbusters was lightning in a bottle that they probably have never captured again since. It's a miracle it worked at all. But for the next film, it took Ramis and Aykroyd some time to crack the script. At first they wanted something entirely different to the original film. They wanted to take it out of New York, but then they sort of decided against that. There's some suggestion that the studio wanted something that was far more identical to the first film, which is pretty evident when watching the second film, because it somehow manages to be far too similar and yet inferior in every way. Another thing that massively impacted the film was that since the release of their first movie, we had the release of the real Ghostbusters cartoon, which made the brand a bit more child-friendly and sanitized, something which the sequel aimed to emulate. The film was also just way too rushed, especially compared to the first film. It went through extensive reshoots and rewrites just 2 months before its release. It was a mess. And of course, because of that, it underperformed critically and commercially. And while it does have its fans, most agree that it pales in comparison to the original, and that in following it so closely, it showed its weaknesses even more. This is just one of the reasons, though, why I feel like going into the context of Ghostbusters 2 seems necessary in talking about why another entry was never made after the disappointment of the second film, and why Bill Murray and perhaps even audiences were dissuaded with the series. But furthermore, it should also serve as a reminder that even if we had got another Ghostbusters film, there is a good chance it wouldn't have been any better. But that didn't seem to stop them from trying, because they did try. A lot. Well, there's no doubt some thought was given to another film immediately after Ghostbusters 2 and the years after. The first draft for what was the most notable attempt to make Ghostbusters 3 with the original creative team was titled Ghostbusters Hellbent and dated March 10th, 1999. The script written by Aykroyd was very literal in its title. The film took place a few years after Ghostbusters 2. Not only is hell real in the Ghostbusters universe, but it's also apparently none too different from New York, with it being dubbed Manhattan, a dark mirror to the actual New York. Hell has become overpopulated, so much so that people are being evicted from hell to roam the world of the living once more. This forced the Ghostbusters to go to hell, whereupon they meet the devil himself, who in the film seems to be a Trumpian business mogul named Mr. Siffler. First name Luke. Luke Siffler. Subtle, Dan. Real subtle. This was a role that later Aykroyd would insist he wanted to be played by Alec Baldwin.
I'm loving this press conference. I love the press. I respect the press. Let's take another question from the press.
That was kind of the broad strokes of the plot. However, we know other ideas in the script, such as Ghostbusters having become a massive company by now, with fleets of ectomobiles and plenty of employees to maintain the cars and bust ghosts. They also have other vehicles, including an Ecto-50, which seemingly is some sort of containment unit on wheels. All the Ghostbusters are featured in the film. We don't know what many of them are up to, aside from the fact that Winston has now become a doctor. There's also cameos from Louis Tully and Janine, but there's no mention, strangely, of Dana Barrett or her son from the second film, despite there once being a lot of rumours that her son, Oscar, would be taking up the role of a new Ghostbuster. It's here where we should also point out two of the seemingly mainstays of a potential third Ghostbusters film, or at least long rumoured ones. The first was that a third Ghostbusters film would introduce new recruits, a younger cast to help carry the series forward for a new generation.
We're going to make a whole new movie with a whole new plot and whole new characters.
Depending on when you read about the development of the Ghostbusters 3 film, the names are swapped out with some of the top comedic actors of the day, ranging from Chris Farley and Adam Sandler to Jack Black and Ben Stiller. It's not clear exactly who, if any of these actors, were in mind for these roles, mainly as the scripts would go through a range of rewrites, and much of this may have been an internet speculation. However, we do have descriptions of what these characters looked like in the Aykroyd script. We had Frankie, a tough, Pierce, New Jersey punk, Lovell, a dreadlock dude, Moira, an uptight science grad and gymnast, Carla, a Latino beauty, finally Nat, a prepubescent genius with a powerful brain and enlarged head as a result. Despite being younger, he also leads these new Ghostbusters, or GBs as the script refers to them as, and a common complaint was that the characters in the film hardly felt distinct, and we learned very little about them, and there was little conflict or characterization to them. But the second recurring factor to a third Ghostbuster film that we seem to always hear is the Bill Murray inclusion, or possibly exclusion. As mentioned earlier, he was hesitant to be involved with Ghostbusters 2 and never liked making sequels, seeing them as cash grabs and rarely having artistic merit. With the reaction to Ghostbusters 2, he was seemingly proven correct.
Odie? Odie, no, don't do the ugly American thing! The British are coming! The British are coming!
It seems there's never been any version of a third Ghostbusters film where he would have a prominent role. Rumours have circulated for years about the extent of his interest or disdain. They've ranged from him turning down a 5-minute cameo, to agreeing if he's killed off in the beginning and allowed to be a ghost for the duration of the movie, to the rumour that he once received a script, shredded it, and posted it back to Dan Aykroyd.
Keep hearing talk about a Ghostbusters 3, but you...
It's a nightmare. Yeah, this is my nightmare.
Really? Now, will you be in Ghostbusters 3?
I told them if they killed me off in the first reel, I'd do it.
Right.
Considering the deal that all four needed to agree to a film, it seemed for years that his lack of interest in the project was one of a few factors that made it impossible. That being said, he wasn't the only person seemingly none too interested about returning to the world of Ghostbusters. Ivan Reitman apparently was not going to come back as director, although some suggestions say that he may produce with Ramis directing, as by now he was more interested in that than acting anyway. The hard truth to swallow with Ghostbusters 3 though, is that it seems nobody was all that interested in the film. Quality-wise, the script wasn't seen as anything special, with Reitman later admitting he couldn't fix the script, and at a later stage Ramis said that working on the script was more of a hobby. It felt like a film that they knew could never get made. It was very passively developed throughout the 90s. By the close of the decade and the start of the new millennium, Aykroyd said that the film would likely cost $120 million, something no one was ever likely to finance, especially in a Ghostbusters movie without Bill Murray.
Doesn't look good right now, and I'm sorry to say that.
It's Dan Aykroyd's spirited battle with Sony Pictures over Ghostbusters Part 3.
Trying to get the next Blair Witch, but, sometimes you have to seed for the big harvest to come in.
Aykroyd insists it would cost $120 million to make a Ghostbusters sequel.
You're talking about billion-dollar releases. Spend 120, make 500.
Not to mention that Sony likely saw the egg on Universal's face when they allowed Aykroyd to sequelize a beloved project of his that no longer had one of its main stars, when they made Blues Brothers 2000, a critical and commercial bomb that pretty much confirmed that Dan Aykroyd's star had fallen very far indeed. Pretty much the last update we get on a potential adaptation of Ghostbusters Hellbent was in 2007, when it was mentioned that they may adapt it to a fully CG film, which apparently would have made the budget a bit more reasonable and was also more appealing to Bill Murray, but it never fully materialised. One problem as well that we have when discussing Ghostbusters Hellbent is that most of our details about the film come from a first draft, which was rumoured to be labelled as a disaster by the studio. There are apparently at least 3 drafts of the script, which may have led to the conflicting information that we always see reported online. Regardless though, it's an interesting project in speaking about development hell, because it really feels like at least the real Ghostbusters 3, Ghostbusters Hellbent, was never in any real active development. It was just in hell, I guess. It seems like just vague ideas and rumours in a half-formed script that only ever seemed to be hyped up when Dan Aykroyd was asked about it. While it never seemed to gain any real traction, or at least the version from the original team never did, that wasn't the end of attempts to make Ghostbusters 3. Want Ghostbusters 3? But that draft ain't good. Who are you going to call? Well, according to Columbia Pictures, you call producers of The American Office and writers Lee Eisenberg and Gene Stupnitsky. They had worked with Harold Ramis on what would be a future box office and critical disappointment in year 1, but on paper, it made perfect sense.
Basically, because I was already working with Gene and Lee, we hammered out a story together. And the studio signed off on the story, and Dan Aykroyd signed off. We will come to everyone with the first draft. Gene and Lee will knock it out.
They had big success with The Office and a history of working with one of the writers of the original Ghostbusters, and due to this, in September 2008, news broke that they would be tasked with scripting a new Ghostbusters film. At this point, it was still unclear, though, if the original cast would return, but as with all versions of a third film, it would focus on passing the torch to a new and younger cast. One major reason for this being such a prominent feature of the scripts, aside from the age of the original cast, though, is that contractually, so much of the gross was pledged to those involved with the series that it was almost impossible to be a successful project for the studio. But this problem could be avoided with a new cast, yet there still seemed to be a major drive to get the original cast back in the film. Once again, the question was raised about whether or not Bill Murray would don the jumpsuit. While Eisenberg and Stupnitsky worked on the script, there were also drafts rewritten by Aykroyd, and eventually even Ramis and Reitman are said to have helped in subsequent drafts. Despite there being no clear indication that Murray would return, it was said that the script was very much focused on Peter Venkman. Ramis insisted that all 4 Ghostbusters were committed to the film though. Yet on the other hand, Murray allegedly told Reitman that leading roles no longer interested him and he was more interested in small roles, something that wouldn't work if he was essential to the script as was reported. However, coming into the 2010s, it seemed like Murray's resistance to Ghostbusters was sort of softening. With Zombieland in 2009, they had heavily talked about and referenced his portrayal of Peter Venkman, and he even accepted a Scream Award on the film's behalf in 2010, dressed in the full Ghostbusters getup. Of course, he had also reprised the role of Peter Venkman for the Ghostbusters video game in 2009, so perhaps this would be a turning of the tide for a third Ghostbusters film. But maybe that was not meant to be. While it seemed we would get frequent insistence that the script was being worked on or refined, it never seemed to gain much momentum. Years later, when the film was very much dead, Lee Eisenberg was asked about his work on the script, stating, "We worked on Ghostbusters for 4 years. It got very close. At one point, I think it was greenlit contingent on Bill Murray doing it. and then Bill Murray did not do it. Bill Murray, I don't think, read it. Once again, Murray's lack of interest meant Ghostbusters 3 was once again going nowhere, but once again, they weren't done trying to make a third film. By 2012, Ethan Coen had been hired to write the script. Coen at this point had writing credits that included Idiocracy, Tropic Thunder, and another franchise that returned for a third entry after a lengthy hiatus, Men in Black 3. That being said, his later work included Get Hard and Holmes and Watson, so maybe they dodged a bullet in not getting this one made. Murray and Aykroyd publicly spoke about the new script being worked on and insisted that it needed to be good or there was no point of doing it. Aykroyd also spoke about how he had contributed some change to the script. Interestingly, he also stated that Reitman, who had long been resistant to another film, had worked with Coen and that he was totally on board with a third film, and that even Murray had shown interest in seeing the script. Yet they did account for the unreliability of getting Murray to return, and as such there was flexibility in the script. From the outside looking in, it seemed like there was finally some momentum on a third Ghostbusters film. Aykroyd hoped that by the autumn of 2013 the film would be in production and to start shooting the following year, 2014.
Well, I'm certainly going to be a producer on it. I'll be writing on it and appearing in the film, and Ivan Reitman will be directing it. So right now we've got a young writer who's working on it, and he's going to be generating pages soon. I expect we'd probably be shooting in the new year.
But unfortunately, in 2014, we'd get the news that meant that for many people, and particularly Ghostbusters fans, that a third film, at least the one we all dreamed of, would never truly happen.
Has lost a comedy icon.
One of Hollywood's most successful filmmakers has died.
He was a Hollywood heavyweight and hometown hero who made us laugh with comedy classics like Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day.
This was a very sad day among those who are normally the funniest people in American life. That's because Harold Ramis died today.
Harold Ramis has spent the last few years fighting something far scarier and more real than ghosts. For years he'd suffered from a disease called autoimmune inflammatory vasculitis, in which the body's immune system mistakenly attacks blood vessels, forcing some organs and tissue to not get enough blood or oxygen. It was a disease that doesn't have a cure and didn't even have a lot of research done on it. It was a very rare disease. As a result, there was a time where he actually was unable to walk, and while he relearned to walk, the disease continued to ravage his body. And perhaps seeing where this was going to go and being urged by his brother Brian Doyle Murray, Bill Murray went to meet Harold Ramis, which was a pretty significant step, and possibly a contributing factor in why Ghostbusters 3 wasn't made, was that Harold Ramis and Bill Murray had had a falling out while making Groundhog Day 20 years ago, and they hadn't spoken since. And when Bill Murray went to see Harold Ramis, the disease had attacked him so much that he actually was no longer able to speak, or was only able to do so with great difficulty, and as such Bill Murray did a lot of the talking, and they buried the hatchet and made amends and reminisced on old times. And shortly after, on February 24th, 2014, Harold Ramis passed away from complications with the disease at the age of 69. Tributes were paid from his co-stars, to his many inspirations, and even from President at the time, Barack Obama. Fans left flowers at Hook and Ladder Company 8's firehouse, where the Ghostbusters had set up operations to mourn the death of Egon Spengler and to mourn the loss of Harold Ramis, who helped give the character and all the Ghostbusters life. With Ramis' death, the project seemed a bit more aimless and unlikely. Ivan Reitman decided that in the wake of his death he would not return to direct, and instead only return in a producing capacity, but intended to help Columbia Pictures find a new director for the project. Yet it seemed to be frequently fruitless. Phil Lord and Chris Miller were apparently offered the film and turned it down. Ruben Fleischer was rumoured to be in consideration at one point. Paul Feig, who went on to direct Ghostbusters 2016, turned the film down as he couldn't figure out how to make it work and wasn't all that excited about making it. Sony insisted they were still working on making the movie, with Ethan Coen and Reitman working on the script, with Aykroyd watching over them. Later, Reitman admitted though that it was impossible to pull off without Ramis, and they were taking pitches from directors, one of whom was Paul Feig, who presented the idea of a female Ghostbusters team. Reitman himself had said that the version of the script being worked on had a strong female presence, and said that many male actors were scared of stepping into the footsteps of the original Ghostbusters. With a lack of momentum and seemingly interest in a third Ghostbusters, Sony moved forward with the all-female reboot. Aykroyd and Reitman felt it was time to give the reins to a new generation of talent, and also hoped that it could revive interest in the brand for other potential films, forming Ghost Corps, a company intent on making more Ghostbusters projects in the future, with the hope that someday it would lead to the reuniting of the original Ghostbusters team and in some way the Ghostbusters cinematic universe. The question of whether or not Ghostbusters 3 has come to fruition or not is sort of a matter of perspective. A lot of people point to the 2009 video game because it featured creative input from Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd and took a lot of influence from their Ghostbusters 3 script. And it also did feature a young cast member fighting alongside the Ghostbusters, the player, you. But most importantly for many is that it featured the return of the original cast and included Bill Murray. In fact, Bill Murray's involvement with the game is apparently what spurred Sony's interest to pursue making a third film at all. And the game garnered praise for its story, especially, and was met with decent reviews overall. So, for a lot of people, this was the closest thing we were ever going to get to a real Ghostbusters 3, especially considering the actors were a considerable age by the time the game came out. But here, they could kind of be a bit younger and a bit more vibrant, which perhaps wouldn't have been possible in the film. However, with the release of Ghostbusters Afterlife, the first film since Ghostbusters 2 to take part in the original continuity, it's sort of become a de facto Ghostbusters 3. Then again, perhaps the Ghostbusters 3 that we imagined and heard about for so long was just never meant to be, for better and for worse. If nothing else, maybe we should just be grateful that the franchise is alive and kicking at all, nearly 40 years after it was conceived. Some people out there seem to think that there was a perfect version of Ghostbusters 3 that maybe we were robbed of. And while we often wait with great anticipation for films in development hell, perhaps the third film was just better off not being made, because by most accounts it wouldn't have delivered, and certainly not after the decades worth of hype. Then again, if you did need to find some closure, try pop in the video game or check out the new film and hope that busting still makes you feel good.